When you're 6, the world still feels new, filled with hidden places and adventures waiting just beyond the next door. The basement was one of those places until it wasn't. It started as a game of hide and seek on a slow Sunday afternoon. The kind of game that seems endless when you're a child, where minutes stretch into hours and the thrill of hiding feels like magic. The basement was the perfect spot. A little off limits, a little scary, but not enough to stop me. I had seen my parents go down there countless times. It was just another part of the house, a space filled with forgotten boxes, old furniture, and the smell of dust and concrete. The light from the hallway barely reached the bottom of the stairs, turning the basement into a hushed, shadowed space. I hesitated only a moment before stepping onto the cool concrete floor. The air was damp, carrying a musty scent of wood and something deeper, something stale. The light switch was just to the left of the door. I reached for it. The door slammed shut before I could touch the switch. The sound cracked through the stillness, a sharp and final bang that sent a tremor through my small body. For a second, I stood frozen, my hand still half raised, waiting for someone to open it, for laughter from my parents, for a voice calling my name. But there was nothing. The silence pressed in. Panic came in a slow, creeping wave, spreading from my chest to my fingertips. I turned back to the door, pressing my hand against the rough wood, pushing, then pounding. My voice came out in stutters, weak at first, then louder. My parents were just upstairs. They would hear me. They had to hear me. The air in the basement felt wrong. Not just cold, but thick, almost heavy, as if the space around me was shrinking. The sound of my own breathing filled my ears, too loud, too quick. The darkness behind me stretched, waiting. And then I heard it. Not a sound. Not really. A presence. Something else in the basement. At first, it was just a feeling, the same way you sense someone standing behind you before you turn around. But I knew that if I turned around, I would see it. Sitting there, watching me. My stomach clenched and my body refused to move. I wanted to turn the knob, to run, to scream louder, but I was locked in place, my own breath strangling me. A shuffle. A slow, dragging movement. Not close, not yet, but enough. The darkness behind me thickened. It wasn't empty. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to push myself against the door, trying to make myself disappear. My fingers dug into the wood, nails scraping as if I could force my way through by sheer will. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning everything else out. Something touched the back of my neck. A breath, warm, damp, stirred the hair at my nape. That was when the screaming started. The next thing I remember was the light. A flood of brightness and the sudden rush of my mother's arms pulling me up, her voice high and filled with panic. I clung to her, body shaking so hard it felt like I would come apart. My father was there, his face pale as he tried to ask what had happened, but I couldn't answer. I couldn't do anything but sob, my small body convulsing against my mother's chest. The wetness spread through my pants, a sharp contrast to the cold of the basement floor. I hadn't even realized it had happened. The shame came second to the terror. They took me upstairs, wrapped me in blankets, whispered things I didn't understand. I heard them talking, their voices hushed, tense. Something about a draft, a faulty latch, how old houses settle and doors can close on their own. I knew better. They asked me what had happened, but my throat felt raw, my words clumsy. The only thing I could force out, in a thin, trembling voice, was the truth. There had been something in the basement with me. It sat there in the dark. It watched me. I was 6 years old, and I knew that monsters were real. Years passed. The basement became just another part of the house, a place I avoided without ever speaking of it. My parents never locked the door, never treated it as anything more than a storage space. To them, my terror had been nothing more than a childhood overreaction, a story they repeated at family gatherings with amused smiles. Remember when you got stuck in the basement? You screamed so loud the neighbors thought something awful had happened. They never mentioned the way I had trembled for hours after, or how I refused to sleep alone for weeks. They ignored the way my fingers still hesitated on the banister whenever I passed the basement door. But I never forgot. The memory lived in me like an ember beneath the surface, smoldering but never fully extinguished. Sometimes, late at night, I imagined the door creaking open on its own. I would picture something shifting in the darkness beneath the house, waiting. I told myself it was just a childish fear. Until the night, I went back down. It wasn't on purpose. I had dropped something, a ball, maybe, or a book, and it had bounced down the steps, swallowed by the dark below. For a moment, I just stared, heart pounding. The light switch was at the top of the stairs, within reach, but even as my fingers hovered over it, I hesitated. It was silly to be afraid. I stepped down. The basement smelled the same, damp concrete, dust, the faintest trace of something rotten beneath it all. The light bulb flickered as it warmed, painting weak, shifting shadows across the floor. The ball was just a few steps away. I should have grabbed it and run. Instead, I turned toward the farthest corner, the place where I had felt it all those years ago. It looked empty, but it wasn't. A weight pressed against the air, subtle at first, like the way a room feels after someone has just left it. A lingering presence. I whispered something, a greeting, a question, and something whispered back. It wasn't words, not at first. More like a shifting in the air, the subtle rustle of something unseen moving against the concrete. A presence stretching awake. The fear didn't come immediately. I should have run, but I didn't. It had been waiting for me. It had always been there. That was the first night I spoke to it. At first, it was just a secret, a strange, private thing I did when I was alone. I would sit on the edge of the basement steps, peering into the dim space below, whispering to the dark. It answered in ways I couldn't explain, through faint sounds, through the flickering of the lights. It told me it had missed me. I started calling it my friend. My parents didn't notice at first. It was easy to keep the secret. When I mentioned it, offhandedly, testing their reaction, they only laughed. Imaginary friends were normal for children, they said. But it wasn't imaginary. I could feel it when it was close. The air would shift, thick and charged. It liked when I spoke to it, when I acknowledged it. And then it started leaving marks. At first, they were small, dark bruises on my arms, my legs. My parents assumed I was roughhousing at school, playing too hard. But I knew better. The bruises weren't random. They were patterns, shapes pressed into my skin like fingerprints. Sometimes at night, I would wake to a dull ache, to the sensation of something unseen pressing against me, its touch just a little too firm. One morning, I found a bite mark on my wrist. The teeth were too sharp. I told myself it was still a game. But deep down I knew it wasn't just playing. At first, the bruises could be explained away. A stumble, a careless knock against the corner of a table. The way children wake up with small, forgotten injuries from playing too roughly. That's what my parents thought, at least. They never asked questions. Even when the marks became more frequent, more defined, they assumed I was simply clumsy. Maybe I was roughhousing with friends. Maybe I was scratching at my skin in my sleep. It never occurred to them that something unseen might be doing it. But I knew. The first real sign came in the middle of the night, when I rolled over in bed and felt a sharp, lingering pain in my arm. It was deep, burning. I sat up, blinking away sleep, and turned on my bedside lamp. The shape was unmistakable. A bite. Not from a human. Not exactly. The teeth were too wide, too sharp. The pressure had been enough to leave deep impressions, but not enough to break the skin. The bruise was already dark, spreading in the faint glow of the lamp. I pulled the covers up over my head and squeezed my eyes shut, whispering to myself that it was just playing, that it didn't mean to hurt me. But the truth sat heavy in my chest. It had followed me out of the basement. The bruises worsened. What began as faint, scattered imprints became deep, harsh marks in places I couldn't explain. Circular patterns along my ribs, as if something had gripped me too tightly. Fingertip-sized bruises on my thighs, my shoulders, my back. Then came the deeper wounds, scratches appearing in thin, deliberate lines across my stomach. Small, jagged indentations along my spine, as if something had dragged a claw there, pressing just hard enough to make itself known. The worst ones came when I was asleep. The dreams started around the same time. They weren't ordinary nightmares. I would wake up gasping, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, but the fear wouldn't fade like a normal dream. It lingered, crawling under my skin like something alive. They always began the same way. Darkness. A presence looming just beyond my vision, shifting in the shadows. A whisper, low and wet, circling me. I could never understand the words, but I felt them all the same, pressing into my skull, curling around my thoughts. Then the dragging would start, something gripping my ankles, pulling me down into something wet and cold. A thick, suffocating blackness wrapping around me like oil, seeping into my mouth, filling my lungs. I would wake just before I disappeared completely, gasping, choking, body aching. Sometimes when I woke, I could still feel it. A dampness on my skin, a faint, lingering weight pressing against my legs, my arms. The sensation of fingers brushing against my cheek, as if something had been watching me sleep. My body ached in places it shouldn't. The bruises became impossible to hide. My parents grew concerned. They didn't believe my explanations anymore. It wasn't just clumsiness, they decided. It wasn't just a phase. The nights of waking up screaming, the exhaustion weighing down my steps, the growing paranoia in my eyes. It was all too much. They thought I needed space, a change of scenery. They told me I was going to stay with my grandmother for a while. I begged them not to send me. It didn't want me to leave. I could feel the warning in the air, thick and heavy, pressing into my ribs. The night before I was supposed to go, I barely slept. The dream was different this time, more vivid, more real. I wasn't just being dragged. I was being held. The presence curled around me, pressing its weight against my back, its breath damp against my ear. The whispers were closer, clearer. Not words, but something deeper, something that sank into me like fingers curling around my ribs. When I woke, my blankets were damp. My pillows smelled of something sour and wet. My arms throbbed with new bruises. I wasn't sure if it was angry or desperate, but I knew one thing. I wasn't supposed to leave. And if I did, something terrible would happen. But my parents didn't listen. The house was quiet without me. My parents had expected the silence to bring relief, a sense of peace after months of my restless nights, my growing paranoia. They told themselves I would be better with distance, that the bruises would fade, the nightmares would stop. But the house knew I was gone. That first night, something shifted beneath the floorboards. A whisper, not from the wind, not from the house settling, but from inside the walls. A slow, wet murmur, something thick and gurgling that moved through the pipes. The house had never made sounds like this before. Then the basement door rattled. It was soft at first, barely a tremor, as if a draft had caught it. But then it happened again, sharper, the doorknob twitching. The air turned heavy, thick with something unseen pressing against it, something pacing in the dark below. And then the moaning started. Not human, not mechanical, a sound that belonged to nothing that should exist in a house. It rose from the basement in a slow, pulsing wave, like something drowning beneath the floor. A noise that shouldn't have been possible, low, desperate wet. The walls trembled as it echoed up the staircase. The sound swam through the vents, curling into the empty spaces of the house, slipping under doors, creeping into my old bedroom. Searching, looking for me. My parents crept downstairs. The air was thick, heavy with something foul that clung to the back of their throats. The wooden steps groaned beneath their weight, as if warning them not to go further. The moaning continued, softer now, shifting into something that almost resembled words, but not quite. The basement door loomed at the bottom of the stairs, just slightly ajar. The space beneath it gaped like a mouth, swallowing the light. The smell seeped through the crack, damp and organic, like stagnant water that had been left to fester. Something alive, something rotting. They hesitated, but something about the sound, something in its rhythm, made them push forward. It knew they were there. The moment they reached the door, the moaning stopped. Silence fell thick and complete. The house held its breath. They gathered their courage and opened the door. The basement was empty. No boxes had been moved. No furniture was out of place. But the room wasn't the same. The walls were wrong. The concrete looked stretched, as though something had been pressing against it from the other side. Thin cracks ran along the surface, delicate and webbed, pulsing faintly in the dim light. Something had been pushing. The air was thick, the dampness unnatural. The floor, God, the floor. It was wet, a dark stain spreading outward from the farthest corner. Not water, not quite. Something had been curled up there, waiting. The silence didn't last. A deep, throatless sound rose from the cracks in the walls. The house exhaled, and the basement door slammed shut behind them. The second night, my parents locked the basement door. They slid the deadbolt into place, checked it twice, and told themselves it was over. That whatever they had heard, whatever they had felt, was just their imagination. A trick of old pipes, of restless wind moving through unseen cracks in the house. They left the lights on, but light doesn't stop something that was never meant to be seen. At 3:12 a.m., they woke to a sound from the hallway. It wasn't the basement door this time. It was the slow creak of hinges, the faint shuffle of something moving across the wooden floorboards outside their room. The bedroom door was opening. It moved inch by inch, a sluggish, deliberate motion, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The hall beyond was nothing but darkness, thick and unmoving, swallowing the edges of the doorway. Then something stepped forward, a small, stooped figure. It stood just outside the reach of the light, hunched and unnatural. Its limbs were too thin, its shoulders twisted at an angle that made no sense. Its breath came slow and wet, rattling through the silence. At first, they thought it was me, but then it moved, not walked, shifted, a weight that rolled through the dark, bending where it shouldn't, pulling itself forward in slow, measured inches. Its arms hung limp at its sides, fingers dragging against the floor, too long, too sharp. And then the eyes opened, wet and black, shining in the dim light. A hunger that didn't belong to something human. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't a voice at all, not really. It was something layered, something wrong. A sound too deep, too hollow, something that echoed from a space beneath language, beneath meaning. It wasn't angry. It was disappointed. The figure stood there, waiting, and then it smiled. Something in the house cracked. The walls shifted, the air curled, the floor sagged beneath the weight of something unseen. And then the lights flickered out. A second of darkness, a silence too deep, and then the door swung closed, and the house was quiet again. But the basement door was open,